is connecting the world by stories, by story. And tonight we are exploring the concept, I like that word, concept of bringing history alive through story, as if there is any other way to bring history alive. I mean, ever since, I even went back in the Stone Age when I was doing my history O-level. The only way I could swat for it to prepare for my exams was to sit everyone around me and tell the whole history, everything I was learning in Mockney around the table. So, and my biggest influence was probably 1066 and all that. Which has been replaced with the horrible histories right now. So I'm going across now to the horrible David Tong, who I say this because I know one of David's ways of bringing history alive is to explore the sewers of history, and but not necessarily political sewers, but literal sewers and so forth. So David, I'm going to ask you to be our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Right, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Can you all hear me all right? Give me a
can indeed.
Right, excellent. Well, as John said, I do like the sewers, and I think it's that kind of horrible histories mentality in not just children, but adults, they like a hook, and toilets, that sort of thing, as a hook. Because many of us, when we were young, we experienced a very kind of, I'm going to be quite honest, dull version of history at school about the great and the good, the kings and the queens, and dates. And if you bear in mind that history is not the past, history is simply our interpretation of the past. We don't need all that. We can get to know more about us. Now, I could talk more about that aspect, and I hope we're going to talk about that later anyway. So what instead I'd like to talk about is how stories, how real people get stories attached to them. I'm always fascinated by that. Tales travel a land. They come into England, they come into Britain through North Africa, through Marrakesh and places. And people long ago, they weren't that reverential about stories any more than they were about history. They always had their own viewpoint, and they would quite happily pull those stories apart and attach parts of them to historical figures. In England, a good example of that is Drake, Francis Drake, the great pirate, if you will, of the Elizabethan times. He became Drake the Wizard because they needed to explain the way that he rose to fame very quickly. So no sooner has he become famous than he's done a deal with the devil, then he's got a magic spyglass and a magic drum. And although that's just stories, still it helps bring Drake to life. Now, locally where I live in Norfolk, we have another good example, a far less known, well-known character called John Chapman. Now, John Chapman was simply a rich member of the parish in Swaffham in Norfolk, but he gives money to the church in late medieval times to help rebuild it. And very soon a story grows up about him actually having a dream where he should go to London, but there he'll hear good news. And of course, he eventually finds gold, but that's an ancient story that was simply attached to him. So I want to illustrate my point now with another story from my region. And it's a story from the East about a Saxon hero called Hereward, excuse me. Yeah. So would you like to hear that story? Well, know this, long ago, there was a hero called Hereward. At least some people called him a hero. Others whispered that he was little better than a base-born thief. Even his own father called him a villain and cast him out of the house when he was still but a boy. Now, Herod didn't care, for he thrived upon the hatred of others. He had a belly full of fire, and he wished only to prove himself, to show that he was a great warrior in the making. And so it was he has many adventures. He goes up to Northumbria with his few friends, and he finds fame killing a great bear, a brutal blood-stained beast. From there, he rides down into the southeast, into Cornwall. There he puts down a cruel tyrant that some called Rough Scab. And having beaten a man in battle, he takes from him his sword, which he renames Brainbiter. Isn't that a great name for a sword? It's a name that would strike fear into the hearts of his many enemies in times to come. Well, having so many adventures, and there were lots of adventures, he fought in far off lands. It's hardly surprising that he wasn't here. And John's already mentioned the date, 1066, when Duke William of Normandy conquered this land. But when Herod and his band returned, well, they grew angry when they saw all of the devastation, the greed of the Normans. Where once there had been Saxon nobles, now the Normans lorded it over all. They stripped the people, they stripped the country of its riches, sending it back to Normandy and France. And Herod saw it in his own boyhood home. For in the fens not far from here, he saw how the new abbot, the Norman abbot of the abbotry, of the monastery, let's call it, of St. Peter's, he saw how he taxed and tithed the people, the poor Saxons who had nothing more to give. And such was Hereward's anger that he and his men, they attacked the abbey. They took all that was glittered and gold, be it coin, candlestick, or chalice. They took it all, claiming that they were keeping it from greedy, grasping Norman hands. But know this, my friends, Hereward's deeds, they lay heavy upon him. And that night, the night of the day that he robbed the abbey, a strange dream rose up in Hereward as the mists rose up on the marshes around his fenland home. For in his dream, an old man came to Hereward, an old man with a bent back and a beard even longer than John's, and that takes some doing. A beard so long that it dusted the floor as he walked along, and the old man had a face that was lined with misery and woe, for it was St. Peter. He beat upon his chest and he said, "Why, Hereward, why have you stolen from me?" Well, Hereward awoke with a start, his heart as dark as the short darkening days of the season, his mood as grey and as grim as the grim grey day breaking without. He realised in that moment that his fight was with the Normans, not with the saints in heaven above. And so the following day, he sent all of that treasure back to the abbey. And then he and his men, including Leofric the mower, but that he was armed with a scythe, they came out of the fenland fogs, that burly band of brothers. They fell upon the Normans as the fox harries the hen. They fell upon their castles, their encampments, the cartloads of gold that fell between the two. And what could the Normans do? For they were as much bested by their Saxon homeland than ever they were by sword or axe or Saxon shield. For it was said that the fens they could swallow a Norman knight and his horse whole. And not only that, the Saxons, they were as slippery and elusive as any eel that swam up the rivers that skirted that land. And that's to say nothing of the boggarts and the other foul fenland fairies that haunted that desolate place. It was said that they fed upon the fare of mankind. But just as stories of boggarts, they grow in the telling, so too the stories of Hereward grew. His infamy, his fame grew in equal measure. He was loved, he was loathed in equal measure. And such was his infamy that finally news of Hereward the Wake, the watchful one, it reached the ears of William the Conqueror. Well, having just put down a rebellion in the north of England, a cruel putting down at that, he would not hold back from slaughtering all those who stood against him in the east. And so it was he sent his spies into the fens, Saxons to a man. Some had willingly taken the conqueror's coin, others had been broken by war and the conqueror's cruel ways. They went into the fens and soon they brought news that Hereward and his men, they were hiding at a place called the Isle of Eels, where the city of Ely now stands to this day. And since they were not coming out, Duke William the Conqueror, he would have needs to go in. And so it was he ordered that a great wooden causeway be built into the fens. But such a project would take lots of labour. And so many a slave Saxon was forced to break their back upon the job. Of course, most of them hated the toil, but not all. For also there was Hereward the Wake and his men, disguised with cap, cloak and hood. They brought their mallets, their mauls and axes. Willingly they chopped down trees to drive them down as piles into the earth for the causeway. Willingly they split those trees into planks to nail to that causeway. And as the causeway, it grew and it grew and it grew, so too the plans in Hereward's head, they grew and they grew and they grew. For he was ever watchful, he was ever wakeful of all that was going on. Well, eventually the causeway was finished. Duke William, I should say King William, he finally arrived with a great army at his back. But he also brought an old crone, a witch, with him. An old woman was more ugly within than e'er she was without. Where she came from I cannot say, but I can tell you this. Her hatred of the Saxons was only matched by her love of Norman gold. And William the Conqueror hoped that the dark magic that followed her everywhere, it would strike fear into the hearts of the Saxons and they would flee their fenland homes. And so it was, he set her to work on one of the tall towers of that causeway, shrilly shrieking, whilst his men marched on the causeway beneath. There the old woman stood, calling, cackling and cursing all Saxons, while she beat upon her drum and bared her bony arse. For she said, "Hereward the Wake and Hereward's men, I curse you all. For you will all fall upon Dame Fortune's wheel this day, never to rise again. For your luck, it drips from your bodies into the foul-fetid fen beneath, whilst my rats have crawled across your bodies while you slept. They have gnawed at your fingertips and at your tattered garb, whilst my worms, they wait in the deep, dark, dank earth beneath to feast upon your foul flesh." While the old woman wailed, and the Norman soldiers paled at the wild woman's wicked words, Hereward and his men were also busy, for they went on shallow craft beneath the causeway where none could see them. They went from pile to pile, from pillar to pillar, painting each in turn with pig fat and pitch before setting them ablaze. Hereward and his men returning to the marsh, only stopping once to look upon the old woman who still cackled, called and cursed. Yet now her eyes, they glittered in the darkness, telling Hereward the Wake that his was a job well done, for the causeway was ablaze. Many a Norman soldier ran thither and yon, not knowing what to do, choosing to leap into the cold, dark depths that would be their doom, rather than suffer the flames. For the fire, it grew higher and higher, feasting upon that newly felled wood. But this was flames, an appetite that would not be easily sated, for now the flame wished to dine upon human flesh. For the old woman was still cackling, cursing and calling as the flame consumed her and all those Norman soldiers who still clung woebegone and whimpering to the burnt and blackened beams. Ash and burning ember danced in the wind as slowly the causeway sunk beneath the water, and the old woman's shrill shrieking was replaced with a hiss of steam. Duke William, he took the last of his soldiers, he marched from that place, never to return. But of course he did not need to, for whilst Hereward the Watchful One, Hereward the Wake, he most certainly won that particular battle. As we all know, it was Duke William of Normandy, William the Conqueror, William the first Norman king of this land, who won the war. And there the tale's ends. And like all good tales, it's a mix of a little bit of truth with a whole lot of lies. But it's all of those lies that bring the tale to life.
Thank you, Dave. And it's particularly important at the moment that, I mean, one, it's part of who we, I mean, I think it's part of our national psyche that there's huge amounts of tales, and I mean, all around the world, stories, folk tales are the stories of poor people.
Yeah.
And it's like, so we whack kings, you know, even if it's just a temporary a temporary victory. It doesn't matter, but it's really important at the moment, because there's, you know, beyond, you know, outside the storytelling world, there's a huge battle going on at the moment for the story.
Do you know, I would say there's a funny thing about Hereward the Wake and other stories like it. I'm always aware, and it's something I'm always concerned about, is that kind of story can fuel nationalism, and that does bother me, because the irony is that, you know, when you get the Norman conquest, not only do they bring their castles, their laws, they bring their cultural changes, and part of that culture is, of course, stories. Many of the stories that we now call our English, our British tales, you know, we really owe a lot to the Normans, and not just because they come through Normandy, but they've got connections with many other lands where they bring those stories from. So a lot of the stories I tell, if it hadn't have been the Normans, I'd have still been perhaps still telling a lot more Anglo-Saxon myths and legends. And whilst they're all right, there's a lot more stories in the world, isn't there? You know, than just
David Daberdeen, who was Windrush generation, was professor of head of Caribbean studies at Warwick University, but he was kind of interested between the language of the north of English and language of the south of English, and I mean, I know you love Chaucer. You use Chaucer a lot, David, but he refers to Chaucer's language as Frankified. You know, the Frankified language of the south. I'm not going to get in total discussion now. I just, you know, maybe pick up some of these things later, or else Claire will never get a chance to open her mouth, and certainly will be midnight before we get to David. So without David, that a round of applause. That well told. And I've had Hereward Wake in my imagination forever. In fact, I've got books of the, you know, sort of almost Victorian books of them, and there. But I've never quite got into it. You brought Hereward the Wake alive for me just now, so thank you, Dave. And
a precursor to Robin Hood, of course. I will just say that many of the things that happen in Axel Hereward are then transplanted onto the likes of Robin Hood later. So we owe him a lot.
Yeah. So, well, Claire, you are hardly dressed as a peasant woman this evening. You're so, Lady Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I mean, I actually I'd be very unlikely to tell in this costume, because I think costume helps you set the scene, but when you're dressed like this, it can be very distancing. And I thought I wanted to put something fancy on, because the idea that you are trying to bring people into the past, and costume has its place, but it can also be a mistake, and it's working out how to get it right. Are you by these bits and pieces you're putting around you distancing yourself from the people, or are you bringing them in? So it's really interesting. I think the noble costumes often distance your audience from you, and peasant costumes are more likely to bring your audience to you. It's a very interesting idea, but this is my posh costume that has not been getting much fun lately, so I thought I'd wear it. But the problems I have with when I'm trying to bring my stories in is when you read a story, especially a long time ago, something like the Iliad, the people in that story have very different ideas and thoughts, and the story is being told as if to the audience that should know these things. And how do you make something as old as that accessible without losing the ideas of those people, which are very different to the ideas we have now? I mean, the Iliad's very interesting. I do a 50-minute Iliad. And you've got to get some things across. You've got to make it so that Achilles doesn't come across as a complete arse who's just making a fuss about nothing. And there's a scene in which Hector runs from Achilles. These days, in our drama, for someone to turn and run is a coward. How can a hero do that? So you've got to, but at the time it wasn't. At the time it was, he was doing something was sensible. It was some things were terrible. He was a human being who ran. So how do you make sensibilities transfer and make people of the past accessible as the people they were, not making them modern people. And this is a huge thing I like getting. How I like without saying, oh, this is something over there, the past, it's something you don't understand. It's kind of bringing the people together, but not losing the people of the past who they are. And that's always a very interesting thing. And I like to do that. And when you're in costume, you want to bring the people, your audience, to get to know the people of the past better. And you want the things that mattered to the people of the past, which don't matter so much to us now. One of the stories I tell, because when I tell stories, I normally do different periods. And I like telling stories which are correct for the period of the time, and using that version that was around at that time. And Dave mentioned Robin Hood. Robin Hood is a complete trial to me. I love the stories of Robin Hood, but the latest I tell is late 15th century. And the stories of Robin Hood late 15th century are so different from the later stories that everyone knows. It's very difficult to tell it in a way that makes the story accessible without people going, well, that's not the story. It's a fascinating challenge. And so I'm always working with Robin Hood. But it's also trying to make it so that you are trying to say, this is what these people cared about, and make your audience care about them. And one story I do tell for when I'm doing 12th century is Toledo Rights. And Toledo is a beautiful city in Spain. I'm sure many people here have been there. And it's famous for so many things. It's famous for its metalwork, swords that Hannibal used to take his elephants across the Alps to try and invade Rome, swords that King Alphonse used to take the cities back from the Moors in Spain. And Toledo, when it was taken back, wasn't sacked. The kings were able to go in there, and the whole city was as it had been. And this is a marvel that is hard to understand. For in Toledo, unburnt was a library that had in it books that the Moors had brought, that held in it such knowledge that had been lost to the West. All this knowledge from Rome and China in a library. And scholars came over all from Western Europe, learning Arabic so they could understand this lost knowledge. And so Toledo, coming back into the Christian world, was a marvelous thing for knowledge. But there was a problem. The Christians of Toledo had been allowed to stay Christian. The Moors had let them practice, but they wouldn't let them convert, and they wouldn't let them use new books. So the books got old. But the Christians in Toledo kept them, and they kept their songs, and they kept their faith alive. They were allowed to do it. But when King Alphonse came, hundreds of years afterwards, after the Moors had taken over the city, there was a new idea in the Catholic Church. Rather than every little land having its own song, its own story, its own way of having mass, now the Catholic Church wanted everyone to be singing the same songs throughout the whole of Christianity, so that all the Christians of Europe were one faith, one brotherhood in Christ. But the people of Toledo didn't want to give up their chants, the prayers that they had kept for hundreds of years under Moorish rule. Now they were with Christians again. They had to lose these things that had been so precious to them. It could only be solved one way. There could only be done by a knight from the Pope who wanted to stand for Christian unity, and a knight from Toledo who wanted to keep the chants that they'd been singing in Toledo for hundreds of years. And there would be a joust. Now, I love this story because I get to there and the audience, they're enjoying it usually, but they're thinking, I'm not sure I came here for a story about Christian unity. And then I get out the foam lances and I get them to reenact the joust of the two people who are battling for the faith. And I'm trying to make it so the idea of Christian unity and an individual town's precious chance have now become something that they can cheer about and take sides on and understand how desperately important this was. And I normally get one side to cheer. Sometimes you get people who will not cheer for the Pope, and sometimes you get very, very protective about the people of Toledo's rights to keep their chants. And it's fascinating to watch that. People getting very passionate about something that people would have been very passionate about, that is something that's a bit distanced from us. And suddenly get people who, if you ask them, are you interested in Christian unity and individual cities keeping their own rights? They go, I'm not really bothered. But suddenly they're screaming and shouting and saying, Toledo and all for Christian unity. And you're bringing them the idea that these things were desperately important in a way that is fun. And that is my aim. And it really works. And you get lots of cheering and it's fun. And it becomes an idea. So I like that idea of how do you make the people of the past real? How do you make the things they cared desperately about that we aren't so bothered about now real? And that is, I think, in a mission I've got. So that's kind of what I was thinking. About the important.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Fantastic. They said that sends up so much stuff, like how do you get people to actually think in terms of, either you do it in the story or just as a, maybe a single line before a story. If you turn around to a bunch of year 6, 12, 11-year-olds and say, back when this story was first told, if you were at home, you'd be just taking up too much space and too much air, and you'd be out on your ear and have to go and live it, but those kind of contexts, I love that sort of sword. And the fact that if you tell stories like that, it fits into so much. You could take all kinds of stuff, Brexit or anything, and say, how would people look at this in 300 years' time?
I guess what you just mentioned there, John, is what when we do stuff like teaching sort of heritage storytelling, you talk in terms of relate, because you say some of their people weren't always that different to us long ago, but their experiences were. So all you do is looking for those relates and thinking how they relate. I mean, it can be a very simple thing like greed, or in the case of somewhere wearing a posh frock long ago, showing off, which children understand.
Oh, yeah.
And adults then understand things like Brexit. They understand those. I mean, especially when you get into things like medieval religion, if you can find ways of breaking it down and looking about, well, they may not go to church, but what do? Well, they go to hospital, and all those things that the church used to provide. And in actual fact, if you're willing to do a little bit of work, you don't have to because there are certain things like religion that will drive people away now, but it doesn't take a lot to find a way around that if you're creative.
Yeah, I think the problem, especially if you're doing medieval Europe, you can't leave religion out because you are creating a fantasy past. And I mean, it's also the problem. Another is that when you're looking at actual stories from the original sources, they are frequently racist, anti-Semitic, and misogynistic. And it's the way to reclaim those stories, but not pretend the past wasn't racist, anti-Semitic, and misogynistic. It's a way of bringing understanding without perpetuating the misogyny, the racism, and the anti-Semitism.
And there is actually, if you look, you'll tend to find for every story that denigrates one group, there's one that celebrates them. So if you're clever, you can put that balance in so that you don't appear to be on one side or the other. It's a really tricky sort of, it's a bit of a tricky line to follow if you're storytelling now. And people sometimes assume that you actually believe in the story you're telling. So that's why it's always good to have another tale that kind of balances out.
And there's an interesting thing Jan Blake did. She was, because another storyteller is the framed story for 1001 Nights. And I'm sure most people have heard it, but the way I tell it and the way most people tell it is that you take the racism out of it. Because the reason the king is so angry with his wife is not just that she was unfaithful with a black slave. And the way the slave is described is extremely ugly. It's very nasty language. So when I tell the story, I focus on the fact that he's murdering women, not the fact that it was a black slave was just beyond the pale. Jan Blake deliberately tells that story, keeping the racism in, because she wants to highlight his, saying, look, this has been here for a long time. She wants to put a ring on it. She wants to highlight it as something, and that is a really interesting thing to do. But if you do that, you have to find a way to do it that, as you're saying, makes that this is not what you're saying, is that you're just trying to say that this is how it was. And it's easier for Jan, she's a black woman. If I did it, I'd have to put so much context in. It's easier to tell another story.
And one thing I'd say is that John actually said already, and it's just, I don't want to keep going on, but one of the things, people forget the power of the introduction. A lot of storytellers think it's about the story, but it's not always about the story. It's how you introduce the story and set the context as well. You know, it gives you much more, and it empowers the audience as well to start thinking about it. They're not just there as passive listeners. They have a part to play in this. You know, they're making decisions about what you're telling all the time. So as long as you introduce it and it's not gratuitous, it's powerful to be able to explore those things that way people thought in the past and the way some people still think.
And I think Claire's put something in where, you know, that story where you both do. It's like how we not just how we present stories, but while we're presenting stories, to actually show that that's what's still happening. I mean, we've got new words for it: gaslighting, framing. I mean, both those words mean how the story is introduced, you know, how the story is put out there, because once that story is out there, it's they're incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
You know, there's before we go on to a whole, I mean, misuse of story, which is kind of a whole nother subject. Thank you, Claire. We every time someone new, we're going to go on to David Heathfield.
I tried a grenade in there about it.
No. That's what I wanted tonight to be. I wanted to be full of grenades. So David, if you can just duck and the grenades and pick up a few of your own and throw them in. David Heathfield, who runs this, who does so much work in stories, in the use of story in the teaching of English as an additional language, but also does costume story and all sorts. So he crosses this whole bit, and you know, and you're going, and David's going into, say, for instance, he's working with teachers in Nepal, in Palestine, all over the world. And so David has to be really conscious of a lot of the stuff we're talking about. So David, having set you up with you know, 1,000 pitfalls in front of you, I'm going to hand over to you, and you're going to hate me forever.
Well, thank you, John, because you've just talked about exactly what I'm not going to talk about. Because I do storytelling in a few different contexts, and I'm really fascinated to listen to what Dave and Claire have been sharing, because that's also a strand that I'm really interested in as well. I mean, I've been storytelling for quite a few years, and when I started storytelling, I was also doing a lot of theatre. So I'm in a kind of that crossover between acting and theatre. I mean, most of the storytelling I do now is folk tales and traditional tales from the world's oral cultures. For example, I worked as a kind of an occasional part of the Royal Albert Memorial Museum in Exeter, part of the education team. And there I was stepping into the role of being in ancient Britain. It was really interesting what Claire was saying about status. And I was the low status local Briton. And there was another kind of actor storyteller who was playing the role of the Roman, and it was the relationship between the two during the when Exeter was founded in the 1st century. And then I was also being an Egyptian mummy and leading a mummification ritual for kids. And there, actually, one child was actually bandaged under my under my instructions. Or I would be a World War II air raid warden, and there was a shelter in the basement of the museum, and we'd have the siren going off. So it was very much not scripted, but there was a format within which there was lots of scope for freedom, and there was lots of improvisation and interaction with the kids. So that's kind of one of the strands I'm interested in, and that's kind of continued. There's I was going to talk about the theme of place and costume, and I'm actually, although I do a lot of storytelling around the world, a big part of what I've done over the years has been to do with location, and that's in Devon. I'm in Devon, and it's really interesting that Dave referred to Drake, so I'll bring that in. But first of all, I just wanted to share a couple of images with you, if you can bear with me a moment, because one of the things I've done over the last sort of 16 years has been not that one. Hang on, stop share. That's the wrong one. Has been with a particular museum, well, three different museums really, but one of the museums is the Cold Harbour Mill Museum. It's a working mill museum in Ufcombe, which is a small village between Devon in Devon, but near Somerset. And there it's one of these historical Victorian museums that's still operating as a museum. And there I'm one of a couple of people who play the role of hang on a minute, who play the role of the manager, Mr. Robson. And so this is where with historical storytelling, you've got the that crossover between based in history but playing a fictional character. And there was a lovely thing that just serendipitously Alistair, who's here in the room, shared in a group that I'm in early this morning or last night. And there's a lovely pamphlet or leaflet about storytelling in museums. And there was a lovely quote in it: "Stories set in the past don't have to be true. They have to be authentic. While anachronism has no place in good stories about the past, imaginative reconstruction does." That's Grudgeon and Gardner, The Art of Storytelling for Teachers and Pupils. Well, this is like that. It's a context within which I'm the kind of Victorian mill manager, and a thoroughly nasty piece of work, who's totally not the same status as the kids, but you can see the kids are buying in because they've prepared and they're coming into this drama. But again, it's kind of story drama. So it's a two-way interplay, it's improvisation, and there's a lot of stories about anecdotes that have happened to various other kids. And these kids are coming to apply for work because they're from impoverished families locally in Devon and desperate for food on the table. So the device or the plot is that they're desperate for work and they're trying to get work, and it's up to me whether I employ any of them or not. But there's another device within it, which is that there's a second actor, a woman, and she is I sack her and treat her very cruelly, and in the end the kids actually stand up and rebel. So there's a wonderful political moment of rebellion where the kids stand up to me and I have to reinstate her, which is totally not realistic to the period, but it's at least giving the kids a sense of empowerment and why unions had to come about. So that's one aspect, and there's the kids, trying to clean the boiler of the steam museum, and then on the right you can see another image of the kids trying to stack bobbins, which is a task I set them, which is completely impossible because the bobbins are all different sizes. But then Sharpham House, and this is another costume one I do. Sharpham House is a beautiful house in the south of Devon, and as an open day, and there I was, and this was a kind of more of a one-off type thing, but I might do it again. I was Philemon Pounal. Now, Philemon Pounal isn't as famous as Drake, but he's also a pirate from Devon. And so at the open day, I did all my research and then was able to kind of recount based on biographies of Philemon Pounal, this story of, again, a guy who raided Spanish ships bringing kind of gold back from South America, and then, you know, got one of those ships, and on the booty was able to kind of establish a beautiful estate, and that house was built on the top of the hill above the River Dart. So that's different, because Mr. Robson is in role, but a fictional character, but with all the attributes of what we know kids were treated like, and women were treated like, and workers were treated like in mills in Victorian England. Here we've got an actual character from history, but again, a lot of fiction, a lot of invention around what's available to me when I research the story of Philemon Pounal. Before I go to the final third example, I love the fact that you mentioned Drake the Wizard, Dave, because I love the stories of Drake the Wizard. And I wasn't expecting to tell a story, but can I just share a little tiny snippet of one of my favorite Drake the Wizard, which no doubt Dave knows and many of the others of you may know. But did you know, for example, so powerful was Drake that when he was in the Antipodes, on the far side of the world, captaining his ship, he'd been away for so long that his own wife believed that he would never return. And she was courted by a fine gentleman. And believing now that Drake was no longer with us, she agreed to be walked down the aisle of the local church, that stone-flagged church, and knelt at the altar about to be wed. And at that very moment, word had reached Drake on the far side of the world that this was about to happen. And he took a cannon and he pointed it down from his ship, vertical, and set off a cannonball at such velocity that it passed right through the middle of the earth and burst through at the altar, a signal to his wife that that wedding must not take place. So that's just one of the powerful stories of Drake, and you know, there's just a whole series of them in Devon folklore, and of course the Drake's Drum stories there as well. But the other one that I just wanted to mention is more recent, and some of you may have heard in the news just a few weeks ago that a World War II bomb was discovered in Exeter, just near where I used to work at the university campus. A massive unexploded bomb, and the whole process went underway. And when it was actually, they tried to blow it up in a safe way, but it wasn't particularly successful. A lot of local buildings and university accommodation buildings were quite badly damaged. Fortunately, they'd evacuated all the students. Have you heard about this story?
Yeah.
Yeah, you've heard about this story. So I was contacted by Exeter Historic Buildings Trust, and they would say, well, although it's next year, 2022, which is the 80th anniversary of the Exeter Blitz, could we not only have an event then, but this year, could you do a little video of one of your stories about Exeter Blitz? So there I was being, well, I haven't made the video yet, but I'll do a snippet of Bill Brewer. And he was a man who he was a historian, local historian, but he wrote an account. So again, it was his own account. So it's a man writing his own autobiographical, wonderful story about the night of the Blitz, 4th to 5th of May, 1942, when he was living up on the hill looking down on Exeter, because Exeter's down in the dip. And he couldn't he was 17 and couldn't stop. His father couldn't stop him from heading down to see what help he could provide. And he went right into the centre of Exeter, was helping the local firemen point their hoses onto the flames and unrolling the hoses all the way down 4th Street to the River Exe, where the water was being pumped up, and helping people to carry their what basic goods they got away from their burning homes. And it's, you know, just an incredible story. But yeah, so more recent, and those stories are based on local historians or oral histories. And I just wanted to show you one more picture, if I may. which is, if I did, hang on a minute. So this is actually not in Exeter. This is Plymouth, and this is Plymouth Merchant's House, which is an Elizabethan building. And I don't think the exhibition's there anymore, but it used to have a permanent exhibition. Used to, permanent doesn't go quite together. Of about World War II and the Plymouth Blitz, because of course Plymouth was destroyed more than any other city in the UK in terms of amount of buildings and lives lost per capita, and there's a display in there, and this is one of the few occasions where my wife Tammy and I prepared a storytelling event together, interspersed with songs from the time, so a sing-along for the family and adult audiences to get them into the moment, the songs that you would imagine, including Lily Marlene. My wife at that moment is got a boa around her neck and is telling the story of Bubbles. And Bubbles, so this is all oral history storytelling and retelling, because by the time Tammy was telling that story, Bubbles had already passed away a few years earlier, but was able to bring Bubbles back to life. We never met her, but there was her story recorded because of oral history programs, and we're able to retell her story, using very much her own words, loosely, pretty close to her words, but also not memorized like a script. So that kind of, again, that grey area between storytelling and theatre, and telling the story of the GI who went off to war, and she never heard from him again, because she found out eventually that he died in battle, but telling the story about how after he had gone to battle in France, she found that she was with child, and the GI that got her with child and who she loved, she raised his son, but it was a tough life as a single mother, but a wonderful character and a beautiful, poignant story. And so this is so you've got the kind of the fiction, but here much closer to the truth, because you've got the words kind of very close to the to the experience. So those are three examples that I wanted to share, and I'm sure other people in the room have had similar experiences. And I don't know, I'm sure all of us are interested in.
Have you seen Beamish in the north? You've been to Beamish up near Sunderland?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, it's been generally Beamish, because I thought Beamish was a very good example. They have a lot of different World War II farms and places, and they had some people getting the kids to come in and be suffragettes. I have to say, I was very impressed with Beamish. They were really making it accessible. They were really bringing the people into those different little bits of the past. And the people who were working there were so passionate. They absolutely loved what they were doing, and I think that's what the thing is, that it was their passion, their absolute fascination for the place, the time they were talking about, just came through in everything. So you went there and their joy transmitted to you.
I think what it highlights to me is different ways of doing it, because although I wear costume and have done for 20 years, I never take on a character. I'm always master storyteller, for the simple reason that allows me that freedom to come in and out of character, and also to, first person is great, but I always think it can distance you sometimes. But that way, if you don't have that, you can refer to Brexit, you can refer to COVID now and relate it to the past. And also, even if you're using lovely archaic language in your stories, which I love to do, you can also bring in the modern equivalent as well. But you see, that's the difference. And I think
that's it's such a broad thing, which is why people say, what's storytelling? It's everything. There's go on a complete opposite to accuracy. I was part of the opening of the Boudica Way, and we did it in a big top. And with foolhardy folk circus, I played two characters. I played Boudica's druid, but I also played a clown slave master, ordering around the clowns, and and also it was the Bishop of Norwich that was opening, and so I introduced the Bishop of Norwich as a druid, as a pagan druid. So that sort of go. And I walked out in my druid costume, and two teenagers came up to me, looked at me wide-eyed, and said, "Are you God?" But that was a complete fiction. You know, well, obviously it's fiction. I was God, but it was it was a complete fictionalizing, but taking these characters and playing with them. And it is. It is everything from what David's saying of bringing a period alive to and there's everything all three of you have said.
Yeah, well, within what I was saying, it's interesting because as the Mr. Robson in the Cold Harbour Mill, then I was staying totally within that world. And of course, I'm in a Victorian setting and the kids have bought into it. They've prepared, they've written letters of application. We're in that world. In the case of Philemon Pounal, there I was with people who are in current dress interacting. And somehow it is possible. People will buy into that. What's the word? The suspension of
disbelief. Yeah, I mean, you're basically
people are so happy to do. I mean, it's not a problem really. I don't ever find you can.
So I'm now going to bring us to call us to order.
Okay.
Get other people, sort of raise your hand or don't shout over each other. If we unmute or someone raise their hands, I call them. Teresa, I'm calling you first.
Good evening. Thank you. Oh, that's been really fascinating. Thank you so much. And I've been interested in historical storytelling for a while, but I've not done anything about it. And it's been I've really enjoyed listening to all of you, all four of you, and it's given me lots of ideas. But I have got a question, and it's about how to begin, really. Mine is like, I live in Northamptonshire in a small village, but I actually found out quite recently that I'm living on an Iron Age hill fort, and I keep finding bits of tools, like stone tools and things like that. And I'd really like to begin crafting a story, and so like I've taken on some of the things that Dave said about it can be fictional, it needs to be set in time, and I'm really interested in kind of setting things within the landscape as well. And I just wondered if any of you four could give me some advice about how to begin.
Can I just say, one of the things when people start in historical storytelling, they can think too literal, and you can actually be quite creative. And the problem with you've got now, you're kind of thinking, oh, I want to look for stories that back that up. And so you're searching for stories that you might not necessarily like, but simply telling them because they relate to what you found there. And actual fact, one of the first things you want to do is start, I mean, when I work in museums and I'm working with objects, you don't have to be literal about it. So you can think about, and the same as applies to place as well, be it a building or something in the landscape, you can think about other ways, and this comes down to this intangible. So say if you found a hand axe from long ago, that's very limited, except if you start thinking about what it meant to people beyond being a hand axe. So maybe if you really want to, obviously you're going to be thinking about stories that back up what you're doing, but don't just be tied to a very specific time period. Think about, again, it comes back to this, how you can relate that to a modern audience. And that starts with the objects that maybe you want to bring into your stories. So, a pen isn't just a pen, is it? It's a way of, it's power. It's about expressing ideas. And if you start going down that line, then all of a sudden you're open up to a huge amount of stories that are far more applicable to the people who you want to encourage to engage with that site, who might have no idea about the Iron Age or whatever period it is. So don't think you have to become an historian and know everything about history. You don't. none of it, I do like history, but my favorite period is the Tudor period, but I don't know everything there is about the Tudor period. I know what I need to know. And I've spoken to a man the other day who didn't know which came first, the Tudors or the Victorians. Some of you may not know that. We take a lot for granted, and the worst thing you can do as a storyteller is start giving people a history lecture. That's not your job. You're once long ago, so you should really, as far as I'm concerned, be more interested in themes rather than periods. The fact is the Iron Age is important, but that comes in at a later time. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It's very difficult. It depends what you're passionate about, I think. Because it's the whole thing about the way storytelling speaks to me is that your storytelling is informed by your own passions. Because if you don't care about it, you're never going to reach anybody else. So it really has to be said is what do I want to achieve? It's kind of thing. Look at it, what does the result of what my storytelling want to be? What do I want to do? And that's the idea. Do I want to teach me more about the storytelling? What are my aims, and what makes it bubble in my heart? And only you can really know that. It's kind of saying, and then you think, well, what do I want to achieve with this act? Do I want to transport people to the past? Do I want to let people know about what people thought about? So it's all this idea about what floats your boat. I think that's what he said.
Thank you.
For me, I get passionate about whatever I'm commissioned to do. I mean, I won't accept everything, but I just get really into the project that I'm commissioned to do.
Yeah, money helps. I'm going across to. I'm going to. Texas Thompson, and I'm coming to Alistair. So, David.
Yes, hi. I don't know if it is true in the United Kingdom or Great Britain or Ireland or anything in Europe, but over here in the States, we have what's called a chautauqua. And a chautauqua is historical, but you actually become the person the historical character, and you have the presentation and it's open to the public or whatever. And I was just wondering if any of you have had that experience of actually becoming the historical person or the historical character, whatever, that you are telling about.
You mean in a spiritual way?
Actually, you dress according to the period of history. You say, hi, I am Johnny Appleseed, or I am George Washington, or I am Sir Thomas More, or whatever. You actually are that person, and you're representing them, but you're speaking as though you are that person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's what I do, yes.
Yeah, that's what David was doing. I mean, I do a mix. I do it. I mean, I think, David, I get the impression that most of your storytelling is first person.
No, not at all. Most of my first storytelling is folk tales.
Oh, I see.
This is just a strand that I'm very interested in and have done quite a lot of, but it's not. It's a minority. Yeah.
Oh, right. But yeah, I mean, I think because, as Dave was saying, first person storytelling is an interesting thing. Is that you have to is getting into the character. About you need to have a handle on what they are, and again, it's what are you trying to achieve by being this character? You're mill owner. You're trying to achieve the idea is that how awful the mills were initially, and the terrible things the mill owners did, and that's a really interesting idea. And disadvantage with first person is when someone asks you a question outside the world, you can't answer them, and sometimes people can get frustrated with that.
You can always find a way. Yeah. You can always find a way.
Yeah.
I think in some ways what David's talking about is much nearer, which is very language based. So it's language of the time. So, for instance, which like things like Keswick Hall in Melford, because they don't pay you to be there for 3 weeks. You know, I would never do that. But you know, because you've got to be there for years to learn the language of the period. And again with David in Texas, you know, the Rene Fair, the Renaissance Fair, where the people, you know, the staff there, or the, you know, they're about 200 people who are there to learn. They're there before the Rene Fair to learn the language. And again, it's all volunteers, because, you know, I mean, I was a sweaty peasant, but I was working for one of the stall holders, and I wasn't allowed beyond their booth, really, or else I'd have got shot by, you know. It was one of the most surrealist moments of my life, completely off subject, was seeing 200 people dressed in Stuart dress, or Tudor dress actually, in on their warm-up in Houston Rene Fair, singing The Gambler. So, anyway, I'm gonna Alistair, I'll never get a chance to speak if I rattle on too long. Alistair, over to you.
I was going back to David's talking about, you know, if someone commissions him, he's going to have a go, he's going to do it, and go back to we had to go back to, why are people employing us as tellers, or for me as a consultant? What is the purpose that they are seeking from us? What are they seeking from us in relation to the stories that we use? So are they looking at thematically, and they want to understand the thematic aspects of the mill owner, or is there actually something around chronology that they really want to know? I'm thinking in terms of museum education, we have to be really careful about what we're doing in museum education, in terms of the stories, as to what they are concerned about in the museum. So is it the chronology? Is it going to be the substantive knowledge that's going to be embedded within the story? And on chronology, I mean, I was a teacher in the East End of London, and we took the students off to St Albans for a day, and I was on guard. I was guarding the Abbey from the students, and they came in, and I looked up and said, "Well, you see this wall painting? This is 1,000 years old." There was this pause, and the students just looked at me and went, "Nah," and walked off. And you get that sense of understanding chronology and the past, and the extent of the past, and how, when we tell a story, we're taking a little bit of the past, is an important aspect can be an important aspect depending on the purpose. But going back to Teresa's questions, I would, around how you're starting storytelling, I would pick up the sense of what is tellable about what you're doing. What makes someone want to listen to what you've got to say about it? So is it that if you've got your axe, is it what this axe allowed someone to do that made a difference to their lives? And tellability is about making a difference to someone's life. Is it something that became an obstacle? Because if it was a weapon in someone else's hand, it could be an obstacle to what they wanted to do. Or does the axe itself become the story, that actually the development of having to make an axe and learning how to structure? So this becomes this isn't something that you just go to Wilko's and buy. This has to be made, and that in itself can be a story, because there's a struggle involved and a change to the life of the person who's making it. I'm not sure.
The artifact is incredibly powerful.
Yeah,
I remember once I was on a walk. In fact, it was early on. I wanted to write a book about a time traveler, so I thought I'd live out being a time traveler. I didn't allow myself to be picked up by a car. And I remember going through Norwich when the peace convoy were parked on Earlham Park, and I'm walking up there, and I tried to sleep below a wall in Chapel Fields, but it was too bright, and I didn't feel safe there, dressed in medieval. I mean, it was so I thought, in my head, I'd gone into the period, so I knew that there was the peace convoy up on Earlham Park. So in my head, it was vagabonds and sturdy beggars. I'll go and join them, you see. And I went through a police roadblock, and they stopped me, and they I said, and I stayed in role, and they wouldn't. And then suddenly they started searching me, and I was carrying, I mean, totally out of the period, but I had a cartwheel 2-penny piece in here in my, and the one said, bloody hell, he's even got the old coins. And suddenly the whole thing was real to them, and that power of artifact is incredible. So that's okay. Sorry, Claire, I cut in.
Oh yeah, I mean, because I often tell using items, and some of the items I tell is I tell the story of the widow's mites from the Bible, and I've got some Plutarchs and leptons, which are almost old enough because they were the cheaper coins to get, and they are these horrid little copper coins. They are worn, they're in a terrible state, but when I hand them round to children and say, look, this is my most precious item, this is the most precious thing I have, this is something that's, and I normally say it's something that's 1600 over 1,000 years old because I'm 500 years ago, they are transfixed by these little grotty bits of copper. They feel and they touch them with reverence, because they are then transported. In fact, this item has taken them to the past, and the fact that I'm giving them value, they think, wow, and they really they become very connected to the story I then tell, which is another way of making religious stories connected.
Can I just say, one of the issues with working with museums or objects, and it depends, it can be coins, it can be anything, and it doesn't necessarily count with mills, but a lot, let's say bog standard museums, is what's actually left. And a lot of the stand tends to represent elite culture. And straight away, you've got a gap between you and the audience there. And one of the things you've noticed with National Trust now, they're finding that their clientele are far more interested in the servants' quarters, because that's where their families were long ago. And so that's something to think about, whether it be Teresa or anyone else, is how you can relate those objects to people who are distant from it. Even in an Iron Age site, again, a lot of what survived, it's by the fact it survived, it's elite. So again, if you can find ways of trying to draw in the poor people, which of course folk tales do, the folk tales tend to represent the poorer folk anyway, because that's who's telling you. You come back to Norman times, well, of course, some people, if we're supposed to believe everyone was telling Arthurian tales, well, of course they weren't. That was what was being told around a noble hall. But of course, the poorer people weren't necessarily telling those tales. We don't necessarily know those stories that they were telling, which gives you a bit of freedom to do that. But again, just bear that in mind, because a lot of museums and that now, following on from National Trust, they want to go down that route. They want to make these places more accessible.
And that, and in that, Dave, you bring it right to now, and it's central to the battle on the school curriculum, which is, there's a great cultural battle going on, and the one side, the ruling class, if you like, with saying, no, if we need British history or English history or whatever they're doing, and what they mean is the history of the ruling class, and the battle. No one's trying to take that out, and but they're creating this story, and it's back to gaslighting and framing. They're creating the illusion that we are trying to destroy British culture. Yeah. Instead of making it broader, and it is incredibly. I mean, I think it's one of the most important cultural battles that's going on at the moment, because they want to force schools into that very narrow.
It's a sad thing that the writers always try to claim our history. And I think sometimes we've got, I always say, I do like the history of the poor and all of that. But of course, whatever you call them, the kings and queens are relevant as well. And we mustn't forget that, because to challenge that, we've got to kind of be inclusive ourselves rather than just let one group.
It's interesting, though, that a lot of the stories the poor are telling are about kings and queens. the poor, folk tales are often, the Arabian Nights is a classic. They were stories told by itinerant storytellers, but they're really about people in castles, kings and queens. So it's really interesting is that stories of the poor are often stories, but they've got a different flavour to them about what's going on in them. It's really interesting how just because it's a story about a king doesn't mean it's a story for kings. It has earthy roots.
But remember, if a storyteller long ago, they would have told that story one way to a king.
Yeah.
They would have told it a different way to a lord. And when they were down the alehouse and they wanted someone to buy them a quart of ale, they would have told it completely differently again.
It's the same way as I tell a different story. I tell the same story to children and to drunk bikers who stop me at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, "You're a storyteller, tell me a story." David Thompson, you got your hand up again.
Yes. Well, where am I going with? I have always found I've been asked to come into higher education for my programs in storytelling, and I have class interaction where the class becomes part of the story also. And I've found that quite fulfilling, and the students really, really appreciate it. Of course, I worked at a small liberal arts university for a while, and the classes were much smaller. I've also would open up before my lecture program, whatever you want to call it, would be say, if you want to know the history, go to the words of the people. Go to their stories, go to their songs, go even to their recipes, go to the people, because we can always, history is more than battles and declarations and all this. It is the words of the people. And I've had quite a successful presentation doing it that way. Just wanted to throw that in.
David, I visited you. It was King Edward's, wasn't it? The university, or something. Edwards.
St. Edwards.
St. Edwards,
yeah.
Not King Edwards.
Right.
I've got, I'm going.
But it is dedicated to St. Edward the Confessor. So hey,
St. Edwards, and but I remember telling there, and this years and years ago, and people were very disappointed that I didn't know about. I said they wanted me to have stories about Beowulf, because I came from East Hackett,
Right? Yeah. Hey.
And I said, no, I tell peasant stories, mate.
Well, that's what I did. I would tell the stories of the people. If I may give an example, I'm not certain if y'all are familiar with the Shakers. Yeah. They were an early religious community here in the U.S. pre-revolution. I feel it that way. Where and they became quite culturally did a lot of cultural contributions. And what I have done in the presentation on the Shakers is actually have told about Mother Ann Lee in her words. She was the one who founded, and then brought the students in by having them come as though we were doing an actual Shaker worship service, because the Shakers would dance. And they had particular dances according to whatever hymn they were singing. And we would talk about afterwards. It would become open up. They would ask questions and we would talk. But the presentation itself is so they were actually in the Shaker community.
David, Claire, yeah.
Sorry, so back to your point, John, about these people trying to only tell one set of stories. They only want to tell these levels of stories. That's often where reenactment does quite well, is that you often have a camp, and a really good reenactment will have one night, and underneath the night they'll have all the other people who are there and each of these people can tell their story. So members of the public can go and they can find out about all the things that are happening associated with one night, and it's quite powerful, because it's saying, oh, there's that guy over there. He's all shiny, but there's the kitchen with all the the oven and what food people are eating, the fact that the poor are eating, or the lower people class are eating different food to the night, all these kind of things. So reenactment can actually be quite powerful in stopping this, oh, we're only talking about that bit over there, because there's all these other people who are just being there and telling their stories to the public, saying, well, I'm here and I'm doing this. And you're right, we have to fight against that, this idea that all the stories that are worth telling is these the posh people's stories.
Yeah, I mean, I could bring David in, and I'll keep my thought till after David's spoken.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to the idea of telling the ordinary people's stories, which is what I love doing as well. And I've got a funding bid in with Arts Council funding at the moment to work with the local museum.
That's right, mate.
yeah. But it's what it's what Alistair was talking about what museums or schools or whoever want. This isn't an educational one, but it's what museums are really interested in is at the moment, because we're online, is building up international communication audiences, and so the local museum has suddenly got a global audience for all their virtual events, and they want to maintain that. And I'm very interested in global as well. So what I'm going to be doing is telling stories about historical artifacts within the museum, but instead of telling the historically accurate artifacts, I'm looking at the artifact as inspiration for creativity. So I'm going to be taking an artifact, and they will be the ordinary artifacts, not the crown, but the ordinary jug or pot or comb, and I'll tell a story, probably a folk tale in most cases, about those artifacts in a live encounter on streamed live with a person I know in another part of the world. So I might be with a teacher in India, or a person who loves telling stories in wherever, in Brazil, and I will tell them a story, and they will respond with the story to my story and to the artifact that I'm handling at that moment, and that's going to be live streamed, and then I'm going to retell those stories. So it's actually taking the historical artifact as a starting place, but actually being very creative with it. So
I think moving on that global level is essential.
So anyway, by the way, I shared the publication that Alistair Daniel shared chat, and it really is. I just read it this morning. I went, wow, 2006, but totally relevant. Except it probably doesn't talk enough about online, but totally relevant to what we do. And all of us as storytellers. I thought Alistair had your hand up a bit ago, didn't you?
I was just going to say about the stories of the powerful. The problem is, going back to what Claire was saying around the night, is those people are there because there is a night. The people in the servants' halls are there because of the Lord or the person who owns the house. That's the reason they're there. So they provide a context within which we can explore other people's stories. So we can't ignore, and the advantage of storytelling as opposed to a written text is we can take a critical response, a critical approach to the stories that we tell. And Dave was talking about the dialogue that he can have with the audience in terms of archaic language or exploring different aspects of the story. That's the joy of a storytelling approach to history, is that you can have that dialogue and question, and you can be talking about Horatio Nelson. What a fantastic national hero he is. Yeah, he was a slaver, and we can have those discussions as part of the stories without, and it can be an aside. It can be a little, you take that moment out of the story to have that little conversation, then dive back into the story. And that's the joy of it. And
folk tales in general start from the poor person, even if they end up at the king.
Yeah.
I when I'm talking to kids, I mean, I don't go too far down the abuse line, but I'm talking about people say, why do things work out? Why has fairy tales always got a nice ending and things? I say, well, that's kind of the point. And I go back to this leaving school at 12. If you're a bloke, you're going to get into bother. If you're a girl, you're going to because the blokes are going to work on the farms and the girls are going to work in service, and the girls will probably be abused. In schools, I talk about it in terms of bullying, but I say you're going to have a really terrible life, and all mum can give you is a story. So if they give you Cinderella, it's not about reaching the rich man, but it's if you keep hold of that central part of yourself, you can become, you know, it's part of that strengthening. And so the stories are not about the king or not about the, you know, the rich people or things, but they're about that poor person who left and how they survive within those things. And I think you can sort of change the emphasis, make the emphasis of the story, or just in that couple of lines introduction or something. So there's thinking that, and there's, you know, within the cultural battle that's, and David and Alistair talked about it just now. There's, because the ruling class, especially in this current, are trying to, and again I see Baba C's joined us. Hi Baba. You know, and the same battle is going on the far side of the Atlantic, where people, there's this illusion being created that we're trying to get rid of certain people's history. You know, I mean, it's the white supremacists in America. You use that as the framing, that instead of adding to, we can take those stories and reclaim them. I mean, in Britain, part of our whole mythology is, because we're an island, is as a seafaring nation. Well, that takes us across the world, and we can talk about all those really uncomfortable bits in the story and not dismiss the, you know, and we can almost disarm the right by saying, no, we know we're a seafaring nation. This is what we did. And there is a power in that.
I would say that as storytellers, and it's not just storytelling heritage, it's storytelling in general. Storytellers, they have a real power in the fact they can be playful and that they can play with people's expectations. Because people do have expectations or beliefs about history. They think it was much worse then, blah, 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 blah. And you play with that because that's the way in, but it doesn't mean you can't then kind of play devil's advocate and give both sides. And even like say gender, for example, if you're working in the school, you can start by saying who's better, boys or girls. And if you say boys, the boys will put their hands up. You can say girls will put their hands up. But you then start playing with that because you know they know that's not right. And as a storyteller, you have that much more freedom to then use that when you tell your stories and just play on those expectations, but also play with the fact that you're not kind of judging her, you know, you're not coming down on one side or the other. And in doing so, you can give a whole raft of different views and let them make up their own minds as well. You know, so you don't have to preach. You know, we're not preaching in any way, are we?
I know, yeah, but I'm not talking about preaching, but I'm talking about using the same method, which is that, I mean, what the whole gaslighting framing thing is where a story, a false narrative has been created, and by story we can, by not preaching, but we can affect that narrative.
Yeah. It's the idea about kind of not pretending that the people of the past. For instance, Canterbury Tales is an amazing selection of stories. It does, however, in it have a blood libel. This incredibly anti-Semitic story. Does that mean that it doesn't mean you should forget about it or ignore it, but you keep it there saying, look, this is a selection of stories which is telling a lot about, it is criticizing the current people in power, it is criticizing the church, it's criticizing knighthood, it's doing this, that, but it's still got this anti-Semitic story in it. Don't you have to grab it all. You have all of it saying, this is the people of the past. They were ugly and they were beautiful. Don't pretend they weren't both.
Actually, don't pretend they're any different to us. Once you get that across to people, that gives them a freedom to understand history a lot better and enjoy the stories a lot more because they feel that they have a connection. It's not, you know, we say long, long ago, because of course they are, but it's not far, far away. And I think that's an important part because, again...
God, I'm going to nick that line. Not. It's long, long ago, but not far away.
You know, I thought I'm having that one.
I'll have that
But, you know, it's an important point because, again, it comes back to this point that we don't want our audiences to be passive. We want them to be part of our stories and make judgments for themselves, not lecture them, but give them both sides, which again, we can do as storytellers. We can give them all sides of an argument.
But it's also how we talk about people. You know, I mean, we can talk about people as being, it's how we name our characters. we can name them as a serf, as a vassal, as a slave, and that's just one part of them. But if we name them as a carpenter, as a blacksmith, as a tiller of the land, that puts another picture in people's heads. And so it's kind of, and the same thing, and you can bring, and that brings it into really contemporary bits, like, you can call someone just an asylum seeker or a refugee or an economic migrant, and that just, but if you say they're a doctor, they're this, they're that, who, and then their story, that's I think we do have a responsibility in the language we use as storytellers. And that's I quite get Claire's bit about using the language. If you're telling the story of the time as if it's the time, you don't put the modern stuff in. But Claire, go across.
Well, there's also, I think that's why I really like the Christmas story, because Jesus is an immigrant, and there's a lot of people who claim that they are Christians who do not like, do not want to think about that.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to go now, but thank you very much for including me in this discussion. It's been very enlightening.
Thank you, Dave. You've been brilliant. Barbara, do you want to say, you joined us late, but do you want to say something?
We a lot of you, I just found the direct connection here. I was on YouTube listening and wondering why no one was responding to me. But anyway, David, a lot of your earlier statements, because I came in really late, were spot on, especially about the connection that you were espousing. And I heard some other people talking about how you connect history to your audience and the importance of words. I tell stories that sometimes involve antebellum, pre-Civil War South. But I'm very careful about how I tell the stories. And I tell the stories from a sense of empowerment as well as a sense of the atrocities that happen. I have a story about King John Silver, and he's a slave. But in the story, I paraphrase Aretha Franklin. She had a song called Who's Zooming Who? And and lately, the last couple of years, I've been asking my audience, who's zooming who? Listen carefully. And at the end of the story, I ask, who's actually running that plantation? The so-called master, notice my choice of words, or King John Silver? So words are powerful. John and I had a discussion in another platform where we talked about there's a difference between a tortoise and a turtle. There's a difference between a hare and a rabbit. So words are important. And I like to talk about truth, but I often approach it from a non-confrontational way. Because once you get into emotional, heated arguments, people are no longer listening to the message. They're espousing and responding to emotions. So the choice of words, someone mentioned the use of coins. I believe it was Claire, if I may call you Claire. I use African clothing. I'll pick people out of the audience and dress adults and children, dress them in African attire, maybe give them a shekere. This is a shekere, it's made from a gourd. And make them part of the story. Give them lines. And when I do that, I notice there's a dissolvement, if I may use that word, between the audience and I. Not only does the fourth wall go away, but we become the village, in the center of the village, enjoying the stories, because I'm very interactive. So the audience is listening and participating, and I'm listening and participating as well. So Dave, thanks. But I just wanted to throw that in real quick.
Oh no, Bob, that says, and that whole bit about, I mean, one of the powers of story is that you can, and it's almost, it's subversion in so much as that, that it's getting your point across without it being confrontational, or getting your angle or perspective across without it being confrontational, and inviting other people to see that perspective, and also, maybe seeing other people's, although,
Well, John,
and we can, I mean, again, depending on the type of storytelling we're doing, we can play with confrontation. Drama has confrontation in it. And in that role of Mr. Robson, the mill owner, I deliberately am provoking these kids to get them more and more anti-me, because they've got an ally in the other storyteller actor that they can rebel, because I'm there saying, right, girls stand behind, look down at the floor, boys will be paid 2 shillings and 6pence per week, girls will be paid 1 shilling and 6pence per week. And it's really heavy stuff. The kids are really.
Oh, I'm not suggesting being soft. I'm just saying.
I know. I'm just saying there's another way. There's the use of confrontation to actually build a community, and then say whose side are we on, and to play with that, and it does become very political. It's about this is the birth of unity.
I mean, Claire refers to it earlier when with her story with people take, but it's just but it also illustrates contemporary stuff. Alistair, over to you.
Augusto Boal has a fantastic term, the spectator, rather than a spectator or an actor. The spectator, that you bring these things together, right. And what we're talking about. A lot of what's been said this evening strikes me as being about creating a co-construction of story between us and the people with whom we're working, that rather than us as the storyteller and them as the listeners, that we are making story together. Now, we're the principal storyteller in that context because we're the person who has brought this tale and brought the narrative, but it's something that we make together through dialogue and through actually listening to each other, rather than me coming and imposing my story on you and creating a barrier between you and me. You listen to what I have to say because I know stuff and you don't.
I mean, I think what I'm saying, Alice, is that if you are talking at your audience rather than getting them involved in your story, that's a disaster. Yep. It's even over Zoom. You want your audience to get a reaction. I've done a few stories where I've actually had people doing stuff, and so have you. But even if they aren't responding anyway, you never want to be talking at people. You want to be sharing a story. I think the sharing a story is always the important way to put it, and each audience member, it goes in differently into their ears, and it's sometimes nice to get them to tell the story immediately afterwards, and a different story comes out of their mouths.
When I say not being confrontational, I don't mean softening the story, as John's pointed out. What I mean is my goal. I have a goal and a reason why I'm telling this particular story, and I want the story and the message to be heard. When I tell stories that involve slavery, there's a built-in resistance in many American audiences that don't want to hear that. Yeah. They don't even acknowledge slavery was there. And I was actually taught when I was a youth in high school that slaves were happy. I was taught that. I was taught slaves were happy and that no slave owner ever beat a slave or whipped them. This is what they taught me. So now when I engage in stories that involve elements of slavery, my message is to get them to, my purpose is to get them to hear the message and become engaged with the story. A lady came out of the audience once and told me, "Thank you so much for not killing the slave master." And I'm like, what? That was him going on in my head. It never occurred to me that the slave master should or shouldn't be killed. The message was not about the slave master. The message was about how King John Silver used his wits to eke out, I don't know, there's a difference in British and American pronunciations, but how he used his wits and his resources to make life as bearable as possible, not only for him, but for many of the slaves on the same plantation. So the choice of words and our energies are very much major elements in storytelling. And I agree, the audience should become engaged. I am an interactive storyteller. And I tell my clients, if you want someone who's just going to tell a story, I'm not the one. But if you want someone who's going to engage people, draw them in, I often say, everyone going to have a good time, but if they're not careful, they might learn something new. And that's one of the accents one of the Southern accents I use in storytelling. Okay, how do I take my hand down from raising it in the chat area?
It's in reactions. In reaction.
But your hand isn't up, Barbara. Your call.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Great.
So yeah, I mean, and the very act of, I'll come back to Alistair in a second, but the very act of you choosing your character, the silver character, is you're framing the story by your fact that you're taking that man as the central character to the story, and almost the slave master becomes you've changed the power, in the story. You've changed that power relationship by just who you're choosing as the central character.
Who's zooming whom?
Yeah.
And to zoom means who is fooling or getting over on someone else. For those who may not be familiar with the dialect.
Alistair, you were going to say something.
Was I?
Yeah, you had your hand up. And
Did I?
Literally had your hand up.
Oh gosh, I can't remember.
That's all right.
Bubba, see, you need to sit down and read when you're feeling calm. The statement from the British government on racism and how slaves had the opportunity to the cultural opportunity to become British African.
Yeah,
well, I'm never calm. So
in which case, do not read. Do not read this
No.
document.
I can read that, but I'm still reading the American government's position on it and many of the states' position on it, because, like I said, in many southern states in the United States, they either don't talk about slavery, gloss over it, or make it a minor point because they say the Civil War was not about slavery. But in the Articles of Confederacy, it says it's about slavery.
I mean, in their statements, they're not beating around the bush. In their statements about why they are declaring war, they are very clear, and it's kind of saying these people. Sure, these are people you like and you respect. Why aren't you listening to their own words? It's bizarre. It's the bizarrest thing.
Well, yeah, you're in the UK. What Alistair's referring to in the UK is there's just been a report published which claims there's no such thing as institutional racism here.
They say the same thing in the States,
and of course they found a black person on there to give this to read this out to us, because so it must be true because there's a black man reading it.
left on
That man had that view before he did the report, so he's always thought that. That's been his stance for a long time. He doesn't believe there's racism in this country.
David Thompson, you're trying to say something.
Sorry, I'm angry.
No.
That what the but the law go into story. I believe what that I can't go back and do this. That we know what it's doing over long ago. But that not I don't bad lot doing it I getting where I am no is there old down the story.
Style of telling stories. I didn't get a lot of that, David. I'm sorry. Can anyone help?
Can you put it in the chat, David?
I will.
Yeah, I'm sorry though. It's it's almost a case in point, isn't it? If someone wrote something and said, that people were, you know, like no one's having a problem, you know, to deny that we had problems hearing that, and that we had someone but like else writing the report instead of David, you know, it would be that kind of ludicrousness, wouldn't it? It would be, so, you know, and accessibility becomes a huge thing. Anyway, if you can get some of that in the report, it'd be great. In the chat, we want Jackie. Where's Jackie when you need her? Anyway, we'll give a bit of time for that. Who else has got anything to say?
Oh, just to say it's been a lovely evening.
It's been great. We've covered.
I'm just curious. This is a little bit off subject. I don't know where everybody is. I'm in the States, and it's about 2:45 on the PM side. What time is it where you are? Where the
7:42 on the PM side in the UK. We did have someone from Canada on with us earlier, which will be roughly within a couple of hours of you, Barbara.
If they're on the East Coast, they're the same as us. David, you have to unmute.
Hi, Vera. Hi, Vera. What time is it in Brazil?
It is 3:45 p.m.
Lovely to see you, Vera.
You are for
Yes.
good to see you too. It's been an amazing evening. You storytellers are very talented, very generous. You know, the sense of human. It is fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing. I really appreciate it to be invited. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vera, for joining us.
Yes, most deaf.
Thank you.
Hey, John, now that I'm learning to...
And Vera, I hope you're coming tomorrow with some of your teacher trainee students for the young storytellers. That'd be great.
Ooh,
I think
that's
some
great.
of them might be maybe watching through YouTube.
Great.
possibly.
If they can come and tell a story tomorrow, that would be even better. 5 o'clock. 5 o'clock
Oh,
UK
wonderful.
time.
I'm sure I'll be a bit shy in front of those so, you know,
Well,
outstanding
Your students can
storytellers.
tell
I'm
stories,
really
Vera. Your
impressed.
students.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Okay. We're gonna wrap it up in a second.
Unfortunately, John, I'll miss tomorrow. I have a medical Zoom meeting at the same time this is going
Well,
on.
you can catch up, see it in the archive at any time. All the programs are in catch up. So
All right.
you don't. And tomorrow, my Tuesdays are my favorite. My favorite day because it's the young tellers from around the world, and they're all under 18.
I've been mentoring and training storytellers since I was 3 years old. So I really like hearing when the young people step up to the plate.
Can you invite some young storytellers, Babasi?
I will reach out. Unfortunately, on this side, they will be in class. Not unfortunately, because education is never an unfortunate event. But most of the ones that I know will be in class. But I am working on, there's a group called Kids Cultural Camp that I want to make them aware of your Tuesdays and see if I can get them to program some time for their students to listen in and perhaps contribute.
That would be
That's
cool.
going to take me a little
That'd
doing.
be fantastic. So what we've got coming up is, as we've said, tomorrow night, or tomorrow, I mustn't say night because I'm doing a global audience. Tomorrow at 5 o'clock UK time. Teresa, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you because it's been really fascinating and really, really interesting to get all the different perspectives, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. And Friday, stories for children, but it's but children of all ages. Mike actually comes to listen as because Mike is Mike is refusing to grow up, bless his heart. We've got Shelley Verma, who's an Indian who is Indian but lives in Switzerland, telling stories for children. The 6 o'clock on Friday. Then on the Sunday at 6 o'clock, we have our worldwide story round where anyone is welcome to come and tell a story. Baba, you are needed. And, so come and tell us a story. Claire, come and tell us a story. There's Vera, come and tell us a story. 6 o'clock on Sunday. No one's at school. 6 o'clock UK time.
No, if you're around me, you're always in school.
Yeah, okay, yeah, well, yeah.
I just messing. But yes.
Yeah, so that's Sunday. So we really welcome everyone. So, and it's the usual business. Go to the website, scroll down, hit on the gold join story button, and that brings you in. You don't need codes, you don't need anything. We try. So,
keep it simple.
Pardon?
Keep it simple.
We would like it.
Keep
well,
it
we
sweet
have to.
and simple. KISS. Keep it sweet and simple. I don't use that other S word.
And we have to thank Ali, who's appeared on the screen. He's turned from being a magic lantern into a person. Thank you, Ali, who's been driving the magic carpet all night. So we'll let it come into land. And you just say, I'm going to do this chat for those people that are listening on things where they can't see the chat. In Telford, Shropshire, there are this is from David Thompson. There are old town stories. And I just say, I believe that what Dave says, I found up north. My friend tells stories, history, in the way that in school the same way as Dave, and he's saying about believes that what Claire says about opening up stories in history. I'm just reading that out for those people who can't see the chat. Vera goes, it was an amazing experience. Storytellers, you're very talented, very creative, extremely generous. Well, thank you, Vera, for that. Thank you for your inspiring evening. And you found your passion of story history, Teresa. Yes, so that's from David as well. So you found your passion. There's more passion. That's what we need, more passion.
Definitely
Well,
passion.
Yeah. So thank you all for coming. It's getting towards. I mean, we said the time here, but it's nearly 10 o'clock in Morocco, so it's about time. It's about time Ali had a bit of a rest. So we'll say good night to you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Claire.
Bye, Ali. See you soon.
Bye.
Good evening.
Thank you.